I do feel proud of myself because I'm fitter than I thought. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I feel very privileged not only to be on this panel, but to be at UCLA, to be in the law school, and to be surrounded by people who are so deeply reflective and empathetic in a time that feels very, very challenging. So I'm going to try and do two things during my presentation, and I understand my role to provide some global context for some of the conversations we're going to have that are focused on the United States. And so I'm going to make the point that the escalation of racialized exclusion of immigrants is global and actually requires attention to international law as well. And then I also want to examine the discourses or the anxieties that are doing the work of legitimating the racialized exclusion. So I want to do two things: talk about the global context and then pay attention to the types of discourses that are doing the work of actually legitimizing the exclusion. So on the question of the global prevalence of racialized immigrant exclusion, I'm going to provide three examples. The first is the most familiar, and it's the example of the refugee ban. And I'm going to focus on involuntary migrants, people who are coerced to move from their countries of nationality because of human rights violations, because of extreme socioeconomic conditions. And the reason why my presentation focuses on them is because in many ways involuntary migrants are sort of iconic of the migrant that is sought to be excluded, especially along racialized terms. And so if I focus on those groups, you'll understand that it's because that's the group that I'm thinking about, that in that context, even though their exclusion is related to other groups of immigrants, and then also to minorities as well in the places where these groups are being excluded. So as many of you all know, in January, President Trump issued a refugee ban that banned all refugees from resettlement in the United States for a period of 120 days. And he also banned Syrian refugees indefinitely. There were some exceptions for religious minorities from some of the countries that are producing refugees. But the refugee ban is a very, I would say, prototypical example of some of the activities that you're seeing all over the world. And I'll talk a little bit about the example of Poland, which came before the refugee ban, but mimics the dynamics in very real ways. So in Poland, you have a dynamic that has played itself out across much of Europe, where as Syrian refugees in 2015 were fleeing from the Middle East and trying to access Europe, Poland very quickly decided that it was not going to be a welcoming place for refugees who were fleeing that conflict. So initially, the Polish government said that it would be willing to accept Syrian refugees, but it would only accept Christian refugees from Syria, and so Muslim refugees were excluded from that. And the reasons why the Polish government, one of the strong reasons that they advanced for doing this was in order to protect the Christian nature of Poland as a country. So initially it was Christian Syrians were allowed to enter, no Muslim Syrians. And then after the bombing in I think it was in Belgium, the Polish government changed its stance. It had committed to accepting 7,000 refugees. It decided that it was not going to accept any refugees, not even Muslim refugees, on the basis of national security threats. And if you all recall, the Belgian bombing actually didn't involve any Syrian refugees, but nonetheless, the Polish government relied on this as a means of imposing a refugee ban that came years before the one that we are seeing in our country. And then the last example I want to provide is from a different part of the world, and this is from South Africa, where in the last 2 weeks, I don't know if you've been aware of the xenophobic violence that's been taking place in that country, largely targeting Africans, so South Africans targeting other Africans, and Somali refugees are among the most vulnerable group in this context. So in the last week, over 30 shops owned by foreign nationals were looted and targeted. This time around, there wasn't the type of violence that you saw in previous waves of violence in South Africa that was xenophobic. In 2008, there was violence that displaced over 100,000 migrants and it results in the death of over 60 people. And the deaths, what's fascinating about, there's terrible things, of course, that could be said about everything, but with the deaths, as happens in many places, many of those who were killed were actually not foreign. There were people who were constructed as foreign, but nonetheless were caught up in the xenophobic violence. And this goes to the point that I was making earlier, that even though involuntary migrants are often iconic of the migrants that are sought to be excluded, the violence and the push for exclusion actually targets other groups that are native to the country that is trying to expel the group. And so yesterday or 2 days ago, this article was published in the Washington Post by Redley Clava, who is a South African journalist, and she makes the point, and I don't know if Alex Wang is in the room, he's the one who sent me this article. She makes the point that Black lives don't matter in xenophobic South Africa. And so here you have a situation where Black South Africans are invested in racialized immigrant exclusion, and I think this raises the challenge or the question of who it is that is committed to the restoration of white nations wherever that is taking place. Yes, there are going to be people who are not members of the racial group that seeks to be excluded, but even in immigrant communities, there are members who are invested in the exclusion of other immigrants, and that complication, I hope, is one that the various panelists will help us grapple with and work through. So having very quickly provided you with these three different examples from different parts of the world, one of them is the US, where you're seeing racialized immigrant exclusion, I want to devote the remaining time of my presentation to making some observations that I think hold constant across the cases that I provided and many other cases that I haven't discussed right now. So one is that the exclusion is contested, and notwithstanding our conversation today, I think it's really important to point out that in every one of these countries where you have racialized exclusion, it is contested, and there are people who are opposing the racialized exclusion, and I think that is telling and suggests that the story isn't over in really productive ways. So even though I want to say that something global is happening, I mean that to say that it's geographically widespread and not to say that it's totalizing, and I think that that's something that's really important to remember. The remaining claims I want to make are the following. So the first is that the exclusion is entitled exclusion, and so the people who are making claims to get rid of immigrants are doing so on the basis of a sense of entitlement, that is the sovereign right of states to exclude and to constitute their political communities as they wish, and so it's coming from a place of entitlement, and that entitlement is one that ties back to international law and to the way that international law constructs state sovereignty and creates very few exceptions to the state sovereign right to exclude. Now, it's not that there are no exceptions, and refugees are among the groups that enjoy an exception in international law, and for states that are bound by international refugee law, there are prohibitions on the exclusion, the territorial exclusion of refugees, and I'll say more about some of the challenges that nonetheless attend that narrow exception. But many of the groups that are involuntarily displaced, many people who are forced to move, actually fall outside of that exception. And so there's a sense of entitlement that accompanies exclusion in all of these different contexts, and that requires attention to the external structures that create the conditions for that kind of conception of state sovereignty. And so there's a very rich literature within US legal scholarship where scholars have talked about the role of domestic law in legitimizing exclusion of immigrants in this country, and I think that's a very important conversation and one that should be tied to a deeper understanding of the way that international law is the external structure within which anarchic nation states can then make all of these moves that we see them making right now. So the other point is that the exclusion is racialized, even though oftentimes the language is, let's get rid of foreigners who don't deserve the benefits that are reserved for citizens. The nature of the foreigners is racialized, and that's just a fact. Whether you're in the US, whether you're in South Africa, your race matters in terms of determining how vulnerable you are to exclusion, and that is why we're here, is to talk more about the racialized nature of the exclusion. Now, when it comes to the racialized exclusion, it is legitimated in various discourses. So they are legitimating discourses or anxieties that, quite apart from the sovereign right to exclude, there's discourses that then overlay over that to target individuals or groups as the ones who need to be excluded among people who might be eligible. And I want to devote the remaining time of my presentation to talk about the registers. I've got 3 minutes, excellent. 3 minutes to talk about the registers in which this exclusion is affected. So some of this exclusion is expressed in the register of explicit prejudice, and I think what's especially frightening about the current moment, or that's distinctive, I would say, just in the last year for somebody who's been looking at the global picture, is how normalized it is now to legitimate racialized exclusion in the language of explicit prejudice. And for a long time, I had devoted my energies towards making the case that, look, that's the easy case, we should be focusing on these other discourses where race isn't explicit, but I think we've taken a step backwards globally, where now people can legitimate exclusion in terms of explicit prejudice. Apart from explicit prejudice, there's three other registers in which this exclusion, this racialized exclusion, is legitimated: national identity, national security, and socio-economic. And I'm just going to give you three quick examples of these three cases. They will feel very familiar to you, and I will leave to Q&A, if anyone is interested, the reasons why I think it's really important, in case it's not obvious, to also attack these other registers that don't necessarily make any kind of reference to prejudice. So this is a quotation from Viktor Orban, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary and who has overseen very violent exclusion of Syrian refugees and other immigrants from Hungary. And his justification is the following: let us not forget that those arriving have been raised in another religion, represent a radically different culture. Most of them are not Christians but Muslims. This is an important question because Europe and European identity is rooted in Christianity. Is it not worrying in itself that European Christianity is now barely able to keep Europe Christian? If we lose sight of this, the idea of Europe could become a minority interest in its own continent. And so this type of legitimation of exclusion, which relies on national identity, be it linguistic groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, is dominant right now. And the rise of right-wing populism means that this ethno-nationalist discourse has become ascendant, and in most cases it's pretextual. It is really about racial exclusion. Okay, I'm going to hurry because I'm out of time. The next example I want to give is the national security anxiety, and this is foreshadowed in President Trump's refugee ban, but I want to focus on an example that preceded that, which is that in November 2015, now Vice President Mike Pence, who was then governor, moved to ban Syrian refugees from being resettled in Indiana. And when he was unable to do that, he instead prohibited organizations that were operating in Indiana to resettle Syrian refugees. He prohibited them from providing social services through federal funding. So the federal government typically administers refugee resettlement through states and state agencies and non-governmental organizations, and Governor Pence actually prohibited organizations in Indiana from assisting Syrian refugees with resettlement, those that were already there. And his justification for doing so was that after the bombing that had taken place in Paris, for the sake of Indiana's security, it was necessary to ban all Syrian refugees from coming, and at the very least to ban those that were there from accessing social services. This was actually litigated, and in a case where an NGO that was assisting Syrian refugees challenged it and sought an injunction. And in the subsequent decisions, district court and also a circuit court decision, the courts actually upheld an injunction against the ban that Governor Pence had been seeking. And I have a quote here from Judge Posner of the Seventh Circuit where he explains why it is that it was overturned. And he says, the governor of Indiana believes, though without evidence, that some among Syrian refugees that would be resettled in Indiana were sent to Syria by ISIS to engage in terrorism and now wish to infiltrate the United States in order to commit terrorism acts here. No evidence of this belief has been presented, however, it is nightmare speculation. And the reason it's nightmare speculation is because refugees in this country are among the most extremely vetted immigrants when they're coming here. And if you're a resettled refugee, it could take you up to 2 years to get here. And so the idea that a blanket ban on all refugees was necessary for national security is appropriately described as nightmare speculation. And oftentimes the xenophobic anxiety that is expressed in the register of national security anxiety takes the form of nightmare speculation. I'll give one final example, which is a quote from a local leader in Alexandria in South Africa. This is the township in South Africa where a lot of the xenophobic violence in 2008 originated. And I think socioeconomic anxiety is one of the trickier cases. So you have a country like Poland, which has among the strongest economies in Europe, and in the year that it decided that it was going to refuse accepting any refugees, and when there were protests against refugees, one of the registers against the admission of refugees was this language of socioeconomic anxiety. So the idea that admitting refugees was going to be detrimental to the national economy. And so it put a blanket ban, would not take in the 7,000 refugees for economic reasons, which doesn't really sound legitimate given that it is such a strong economy, especially when you compare it to a country like Lebanon, which has over 1 million Syrian refugees and can barely sustain that that population. So there's some cases where pretext is obvious, and there's other cases where it is not. And the cases where it is not, I would argue, are actually geopolitically determined. So there's parts of this world, predominantly in the global south, where it is that refugees are regionally contained, and where involuntary migrants are regionally contained. And governments in those countries, when they make claims about socioeconomic anxieties, are different in ways, because you can see conditions that suggest that there might be some kind of basis. But even in those contexts, I would argue that it is very dangerous to not mark socioeconomic anxiety against involuntary migrants as normatively out of bounds because of a number of reasons. Pretext might be one of them. Another might be self-fulfilling prophecy. So you have scholars who've argued convincingly that when you exclude groups on socioeconomic basis and it's racially specified, the groups that you're targeting, you can create castes, and you can create a self-fulfilling prophecy so that the things that you are claiming exist that do not exist end up being created, and so that's a problem. And then even quite apart from that, socioeconomic anxiety that targets involuntary migrants is often targeting the wrong actor or the wrong source of any kind of socioeconomic insecurity. And I'll end by saying that in the South African example, we have a leader here who is upset about the benefits that he imagines the South African government to be providing to refugees and involuntary migrants. The benefits are very few and far between, and so that claim is already overstated. But this statement belies South Africa's role on the continent. So South Africa is the biggest economic actor on the continent. Its markets dominate those of other countries, and so it has that presence. And then it relies on a very strong and robust migrant labor force, and has for many years, and that's completely elided in the assessment. And so in conclusion, the 2 points I wanted to make are, one, that what we're seeing in this country is part of a much larger global picture that is tied to the way that sovereignty is constructed elsewhere. And then there's an overlay. So apart from the entitlements that sovereignty brings, there are discourses that then do the work of legitimizing racialized exclusion, oftentimes absent the language of racial prejudice. And it's important to mark those as xenophobic anxiety, and to similarly consider them as presumptively out of bounds, at least from a normative perspective. I will end there, and I look forward to questions.